If your last relationship didn't end so well, I can imagine that you're eager to not repeat the same mistakes of the past. I especially hear this a lot after divorce from men, that there were a lot of things that their ex-wife said was their problem, that they were the issue, that they were emotionally unavailable, that they weren't supportive enough, that they weren't helpful enough, that they were too needy or too absent, right? So how do you not repeat the same mistakes that ended your marriage before? How do you go forth into a new relationship without falling into those same old cycles of arguing, of pulling away, of withdrawing, of being overly anxious, whatever your cycle is? How do we shift it? You shift from reacting to responding. So let's look at what that looks like. Reacting is automatic. You have a trigger, right? Something that your partner says or doesn't say, does or doesn't do, right? They don't return your texts or phone calls. You have an emotional response. They say a certain word that reminds you a lot of what your ex said, or maybe even about the way your mom spoke to you when you were a kid, and you feel a certain surge of anxiety, insecurity, or anger. Right, so reaction is characterized by an immediate emotional response to a trigger, followed by meaning making. You make that feeling mean something. So she doesn't return your calls, you feel anxious, your brain says, oh my gosh, she doesn't like me. This is never going to work. What's the point? Why bother trying? She criticizes your outfit and you think, oh my gosh, what a bitch, this is never going to work. I can't deal with this, and you pull away. Or if you're more of an anxious attachment style, you might do the opposite. You might be like, oh my gosh, this isn't enough for her. I've got to get better. I've got to dress better. I've got to, right? And your brain starts making all these meanings. She's going to leave. She doesn't like me. I'm not enough for her. This is never going to work. Your brain makes this meaning out of that initial emotional response. And then you start acting in certain ways, right? You act in very predictable ways. You know your cycles. You know how you argue, right? You know what you do. Do you get mean and loud? Do you say things that you regret later on? Do you pull away and stop talking? Maybe you don't talk to your partner for days on end after an argument. You know what you do in these situations because it's the same thing that you have done probably your entire life, right? You've learned these ways of interacting since you were a kid, and you're just on autopilot. You get triggered, you react, right? You get triggered, you have a feeling, you make meaning out of it in your brain, and then you act in predictable ways that are very, very familiar. And then later you look back and you go, crap, I just made all the same old mistakes again and again and again. The difference with responding is that we don't just run with that initial feeling. You notice it, right? It still happens. You get triggered. You get triggered by what she says. You get triggered by what she does. You notice that feeling come up. You notice your brain being like, oh my God, this is never going to work. Oh, she hates me. I'm not good enough. Or she's being unreasonable and we have to convince her otherwise, right? Whatever your story is. But because you know that story, because you've spent time witnessing it and tracking it, you recognize it. It's happening and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Brain, this is that old story that you like to tell me all the time. Is that really what's going on? Right? My brain's telling me that she's being unreasonable and I have to convince her otherwise. Why does that feel so important to me? What's wrong with letting her have a different opinion than mine? Is it true that a relationship can't work out if we're not on the exact same page about every opinion and belief? Right? You can start to question, and then you get curious. A hallmark of responding is to cultivate curiosity. So instead of running with this emotion, instead of believing what my brain is telling me about this situation, and instead of just acting out in my normal reactive way, I'm going to get really curious about myself and curious about this other person. But I actually want to know what's going on. Why aren't you texting back, right? What's really going on in her mind? What's happening in her life? Maybe her dog just died. Maybe there's something going on at work. Maybe she just really values her space and doesn't spend a lot of time on her phone. Right? In the argument, why is it so important to defend myself and convince her? Instead of reacting to her words, can I get curious? Well, why is this so important to her? Why is she so upset? Where is that anger actually coming from? If I assume that it's not actually about me, if I'm like, oh, brain, you're just telling me this story, let's respond thoughtfully, gently, compassionately, and with the assumption that what she's feeling isn't my fault. That's at the root of the difference between reacting and responding. When we react, it's because we think that the other person is making us feel something, or that we're making them feel something. So either we feel upset with them for hurting us, or we feel guilty for hurting them, and we react. Responding puts us in a place of curiosity where we recognize, you didn't hurt my feelings, right? You didn't make me angry. That was my reaction. You're just the trigger, right? I have this habit of feeling anxious, of getting hurt, of taking this personally, of feeling attacked. And I have this habit of thinking that way and feeling that way. You're just the trigger. You said the words. My emotions surged. My brain went, oh my gosh, red alert. And I go down this whole cycle of reactivity. And when I'm responding, I put a check on that. I'm like, wait a minute. Well, your words are not making me angry, right? You don't have that power. You can't make me angry. I do that. I make me angry. My thoughts make me angry. My habit of responding to this trigger makes me angry, not this other person. The same is true of anxiety. The same is true of fear and sadness. The other person's not doing it to you. It is your internal experience based on your beliefs, your learned experiences, things that you have had happen to you in your life that you've stored and expect to happen to you again. But it's all coming internally. What you feel is all tied up in what you think and what's happened to you in the past. It really has nothing to do with that other person. And the same is true the other direction. When she's mad at you, it's not your fault. You're not making her mad, right? You're not that powerful. Imagine if you were, right? Wouldn't that be great in relationships if you were that powerful? Because you could just make her happy all the time, right? You could just make her love you. You could just make her feel good. You can't. Right? You try, I try, we all try with our partners. You cannot control the way they feel because you don't cause it. So when she's angry, instead of feeling attacked and getting defensive and reacting, I can choose instead to respond with the knowledge that it's not my fault. She might be yelling at me and saying it is my fault. That's okay. She's allowed to think that, right? That's her opinion. I don't have to take that on. I don't have to take it personally. I don't have to respond with anger. I can respond calmly from a grounded center of knowing who and what I am, and with curiosity and compassion for her. Right? Wow, I hear that you're really upset about this right now. Tell me more about that. Right? You can start to have real conversations, real intimate and vulnerable conversations with people when you don't take on all of their stuff and when you don't blame them for your own cycles of emotion and belief. That's the difference between reacting and responding. If I'm reacting, I believe that you're causing my feelings or I'm causing yours, and I'm all worked up in drama around that. If I'm responding, I recognize that I'm responsible for my thoughts and feelings. You're responsible for your thoughts and feelings. And I'm curious and I'm compassionate and I want to relate to you and connect with you. And I want to understand where you're coming from, but I'm not going to make it about me. It totally changes the way we show up in relationships. And it is the simplest change that you can make to avoid repeating old mistakes. It doesn't matter what mistakes you used to make in your relationship, right? Maybe you got angry, maybe you withdrew, maybe you were too needy or not needy enough. Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. You do the same thing. Become aware of what that reaction is. How do you feel? What do you think? What do you do? And most importantly, what is the trigger? What is it that sets off all of that reaction with you? What is your autopilot response in these situations? And then once you're aware, you start to notice and you can catch yourself. You can be like, oh yeah, here I go. Here I go down that reaction again. I'm believing that she's making me angry. I'm believing that she's making me insecure. I'm believing that she's hurting my feelings, right? Or I'm believing that I'm doing that to her and getting all caught up in my reaction of guilt and shame. So when you start to notice, you can check it and your brain's like, oh yeah, we don't have to go there. And I don't have to engage in that cycle. You create flexibility in your response, right? Now you can be responsive instead of reactive. We've all made mistakes in the past. Right? We've all messed up in our relationships. And sometimes when that leads to a divorce or the end of a long-term relationship, it can leave us really full of self-doubt and questioning, like, are we any good at relationships? Can I even have one? Can this work? What if I just keep messing up over and over and over again? I can't go through it, right? It's too much, it's too painful. I want to encourage you, we all make these mistakes. We are all human. We all have these automatic cycles of reactivity, right? That we learn when we're kids. And it doesn't matter how long you've been reacting the same way. It doesn't matter how deeply ingrained those patterns are. You can change them if you want to. And it starts with awareness. You have to know what your reactive cycle is. What do you do? How do you feel? What do you think? How do you act? What triggers you? And then start to observe it. Notice when it's happening. As soon as you bring your awareness to it in the moment, you create space to respond in a new way. What if it's not about you? What if you're not the reason she's crying? Right? What if you're not responsible for how she feels? What if she's not responsible for how you feel? And yet, we can connect. We can support each other. We can be there for each other. That's what love and relationships are all about. How do I stay grounded, stay anchored in my knowing of who I am and owning my own emotional experience, and connect, love, support, and live with, be with another human? And it's actually easier to connect deeply, to love intimately, to have that fiery passion and lifelong partnership kind of relationship with another person. It's much easier to do when you can hold that emotional ownership for yourself. Because it's really hard for me to be truly compassionate and curious about your experience. Empathy is hard for me if I'm making everything about me. If I'm taking on all of your emotions, if I'm taking responsibility for everything you feel, if I'm worried, I've got way too much skin in the game then, right? I can't actually be curious and compassionate about your experience when it has huge implications for my emotional well-being. I'm too reactive, I'm too defensive. Instead, when I'm grounded, when I'm centered, when I'm emotionally whole and responsive, I'm suddenly there for the people in my life in a very, very different way, which creates much deeper, much richer relationships. And you don't have to worry about those mistakes anymore because you're just showing up as an authentic, grounded human being with curiosity and compassion and a clear sense of your own, essentially emotional boundaries, owning the way I think and feel. So if you want to avoid making the same old mistakes in your relationships, practice responding instead of reacting. And if you don't know where to start or that sounds overwhelming, reach out, book a free strategy session with me, and we'll talk it out and I'll show you the path forward to having healthier, happier relationships with less mistakes. Stop reacting, start responding.